The video for today is something of a companion piece to last week's video on HMS Audacity. In that video, we looked at the first British escort carrier, a ship that you sometimes see described as the first escort carrier, period. This is a bit of a point of contention between Audacity and the topic of today's video, USS Long Island. Which one is the first escort carrier depends a bit on who you ask or what source you're using. Purely based on commissioning date, Long Island is first by a couple weeks. June 2nd, 1941 compared to June 17th, 1941 for Audacity, or Empire Audacity at that time, with Freedman giving a later completion date of June 26th and sea trials in early July. By contrast, Audacity began her conversion first. That started in January 1941, while Long Island only began her conversion in March of 1941. So if you use that metric, Audacity was first. In the end, which one is first is largely academic. They served fairly different roles and are almost mirrors of each other. Audacity was a quick conversion to get a combat ship as fast as possible. Long Island was an even quicker conversion, but for more secondary duty instead. This even applies to their service histories. Audacity shined bright and burnt out quickly. She was sunk within a few months of joining service. Long Island had a distinctly quieter life and would survive the entire war. Not just the war, but conversion back to a merchant ship. She wouldn't be scrapped until all the way in 1977. You can probably see why I chose to cover these two back to back like this. That aside, let's get into things with the origin of Long Island's design, where one of the first things to keep in mind is the ship did not originate as a combat warship. While one often thinks of escort carriers protecting convoys or supporting land invasions, that wasn't the original intention, at least not on the American side. There was a similar idea in the early 1930s with the XCV, which resemble escort carriers in being conversions of merchant ships. However, those were best described as small and slow fleet carriers, not too dissimilar from how escort carriers could be used in direct combat, but the intended roles were different. By contrast, in the lead up to Long Island, the Navy had far more austere ideas. In fact, the entire concept of an escort carrier didn't even exist yet. When designed, USS Long Island would actually be designated AVG-1, which Freedman notes is a modification of the AV designation used for seaplane tenders. It became Aircraft Tender General Purpose, and this would then be changed to ACV later on for Auxiliary Aircraft Carrier. As I noted in the Audacity video, the designation really does matter. It shows what a ship is intended for. This is why the British shifted from calling their ship an Auxiliary Aircraft Carrier to an escort carrier. It fit her role better. As for Long Island, her initial designations did actually fit her role, an auxiliary ship for secondary support duty, more than a convoy escort. You can see this in how the design originated. This came in October 1940, both from the Navy and from President Roosevelt. In the case of the President, he wanted merchant ship conversions that could operate autogyros. Ironically, not that far off from what the Japanese army eventually contemplated for Akitsu Maru. That idea wouldn't go anywhere, though, because tests with the autogyros were an embarrassing failure. the available aircraft simply couldn't carry offensive weaponry. Moreover, the potential advantage, a short landing distance, wasn't as much of an edge as you might think. Even an autogyro would struggle to land on a ship with a partial flight deck due to issues with turbulence, thus requiring a full-length flight deck, at which point one might as well go for fixed-wing aircraft. As a result, you have the other proposal in late 1940, this time from Admiral Halsey, who was initially looking for a class of auxiliary carriers, thus the designation for pilot training and aircraft transport, while the training role would eventually be taken up by Wolverine and Sable on the Great Lakes. The transport role had merit. Enough merit for it to be punted up the chain, where it arrived to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark. Admiral Stark would hold a set of conferences on merchant ship conversions in January 1941 as a result. One of the most important notes here is that whatever conversion was done, it needed to be a twofer. One ship for the Navy and a sister ship that could be purchased by the British. This would result in two ships being put aside, new C-3 freighters, Mormick Mail and Mormick Land. The former would become Long Island. The latter would become HMS Archer, the ship that went to the British, and a rather less successful one as it turned out. But that's a story for another day. For now, Long Island's conversion began. Roosevelt insisted on a breakneck pace of 3 months for the conversion, despite the Navy wanting a slower and more thorough job. But the president got his way. Mormick Mail was taken in for conversion on March 6, 1941, and completed on June 2nd of the same year, which is a good point to touch on the design before we move on. Initially, Long Island would have a partial flight deck of 362 feet or 110 meters. This extended aft from the pilot house, still in place from the C-3 design. For reference, the ship's hull was 492 feet, 150 meters long. The resulting ship looks almost Japanese in a way. Compare her to something like Shoho or the initial design of Ryuho. This was considered enough to land a scout aircraft, but not much else, further reflecting her secondary role. The plane in question being a Curtiss SOC-3 Seagull, a biplane which probably helped in landing on a short runway. On the other hand, the ship did come with a catapult for launching aircraft, which made up a bit for the short flight deck, although not quite enough, as we'll see. To support her aircraft, Long Island had a simple hangar deck built on top of the original main deck. This was serviced by a single elevator at the forward end, to support around 10 of the Seagull Scouts and 6 Curtiss Helldivers, for a total of 16 aircraft. This being the biplane variety Helldiver, not the infamous SB-2C of later years, with the ship also operating Brewster Buffaloes at various points, and Wildcats as well. For defensive weaponry then, Long Island had a relatively heavy battery, one 5-inch 51 caliber gun on the stern, and then two 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns on the bow, with 4 50 caliber machine guns rounding things off. Considering her size and relatively early service, that's not bad. It wouldn't be good for the Pacific War, but for June 1941, not as surprising. Now, if you're familiar with my videos, you might have noticed we're going in reverse order. I normally do displacement first, Well, there's a reason for this change. By September 1941, Long Island was recognized as not exactly ideal. The flight deck in particular was far too short. So this was extended forward by 77 feet, 23 meters over the pilot house. Still not all the way to the tip of the bow, but further ahead. She also gained more watertight subdivision, with all of this ultimately resulting in a displacement that varies between sources. Friedman cites 13,324 tons standard, with that tonnage pushed through the water at around 16.5 knots on 8,500 horsepower through one screw. Evidently, the Navy expected something more like 18 knots, which admittedly she almost hit on trials. Regardless, that rounds off the design details. Now for service history, which, as I alluded to at the start, isn't exactly the most adventurous out there. At first, Long Island puttered about the East Coast, testing how well aircraft could operate from her deck. She was very much an experimental ship, and experience gained from testing could be put towards future conversions. This was an important role, especially with how many escort carriers would end up being built. But it was also a quiet one, lasting from her commissioning in June 1941 through to December, broken up by that refit in September to extend the flight deck. In the end, Long Island's career only changed with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, as it often did for American ships. This would see her escort a convoy to Newfoundland before returning to Norfolk to qualify carrier aviators. This training would keep the ship occupied until May 1942, at which point on May 10th she set sail for the Pacific, arriving in San Francisco on June 5th, 1942. She wouldn't remain there for long, almost immediately setting sail with 4 battleships under Admiral William Pye. She would remain with that group, providing air cover until July 17th. In this role, Long Island served well enough, although even the old standard battleships were fully capable of outpacing her. In any case, the carrier returned to pilot training duty for the rest of July. With the end of that month, however, came the first voyage to an active combat theater. Long Island loaded up 2 squadrons of replacement Marine aircraft on August 2nd, 1942, before setting sail for the South Pacific, where the invasion of Guadalcanal would begin on August 7th. As for Long Island, she reached Fiji on August 13th, then steamed to about 200 miles southeast of Guadalcanal to launch those replacement aircraft on August 20th. Demonstrating how many planes could be crammed aboard if necessary, Long Island launched 30 aircraft, 18 F-4F Wildcats, and 12 SBD Dauntlesses, the first Marine aircraft to land on the island. While those planes and pilots would become the genesis of the Cactus Air Force, this was the closest Long Island came to actual combat, although it was still important enough to be memorialized by a movie. As for the carrier, now reclassified as ACV-1, she sailed for safer waters. First the New Hebrides on August 23rd, then onto the West Coast by September 20th, 1942. Newer and more capable escort carriers were coming online, so Long Island was relegated back to training duty. In this, just like Wolverine and Sable, Long Island would give good duty. Not famous, not exciting, but well-trained pilots are crucial to any war effort. And this ship trained quite a few pilots through the end of 1943. even after she was reclassified again to CVE-1 on July 15, 1943. As for 1944 and 1945, Long Island would transport aircraft and pilots to various Pacific islands. Never to the front line, mind you, but more replacements for backline bases. Valuable, but not putting the ship at any real risk of sinking. As a result, she survived the war without damage. Her last role with the Navy would come in Magic Carpet transport runs, bringing men home at the end of 1945, with Long Island decommissioned on March 26, 1946. She would then be sold off for scrapping in April 1947, only for this to not happen. The ship was bought up by Canada Europe Line to be converted into an immigrant transport in 1948. Several old ships would end up in this duty after the war. This role lasted under the name Nellie until 1953, at which point she was sold off once more. Renamed to Seven Seas, she would spend 13 years sailing under that name, including a serious fire in 1965 with the ship reduced to stationary service. Seven Seas ended her days as a hostel, finally being scrapped in 1977 in Belgium. A long and successful career by any metric, I think. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.